Screams don't echo through the Welsh hills. They hide, buried deep inside castle walls, sealed behind stone chambers where torches burn low and shadows stretch long. No ballads, no laughter, only the muffled cries of those who never asked to be part of history. Behind the walls of the Welsh royal courts, there was no chivalry, no shining knight in armor. What ruled here wasn't honor, it was hunger. A hunger so raw, so violent, that it devoured everything in its path. Kings and princes didn't just wield swords. They wielded flesh. They used desire as a weapon sharper than steel, a tool of control, humiliation, and terror. The courts were painted as symbols of grandeur. To the peasants outside, they looked untouchable, godlike. But step inside, and the truth bleeds through the cracks. Chambers that smelled of sweat and smoke. Floors slick with spilled wine and spit. Nights filled with forced marriages. Incest that tied families into knots of madness. And punishments so brutal, they scarred not only the body, but the soul. Women weren't queens of romance. They were bargaining chips. Bought, traded, taken. Their bodies stamped with the seal of alliance. Their screams muffled by duty. Some were locked away for years, their worth measured only by the purity of their blood. Others were flaunted as trophies mistresses paraded before enemies, stripped of dignity, stripped of choice. And men weren't free either. Young boys born into the court became pawns in games they couldn't escape, used as objects of dominance, shaped by violence until their own hands repeated the cycle. In these walls, no one truly owned their body. Every touch was a transaction. Every breath came at a cost. You don't hear music in these halls. You hear the drag of chains across stone. The Welsh courts were not ruled by law. They were ruled by secrets. Secrets so dark that they were buried beneath centuries of myth and legend. Behind every tale of noble kings and heroic battles lies another story, of beds that became battlefields, of heirs born in shadows, of bloodlines twisted by lust. This isn't courtly love. This is control. This is incest woven into dynasties, cousins forced into marriages to preserve a crown, sisters claim to keep power unbroken. Every union carried whispers, whispers of betrayal, whispers of forbidden touch, whispers that echoed louder than prayers in chapel halls. When adultery was discovered, punishment came swift and merciless. A woman accused of straying was dragged before the court, her hair hacked away in clumps, her skin slashed by whips until red lines carved across her back. Some were banished to convents, others left to rot in cold stone towers, their names erased from history. Men who dared to challenge a king's claim could find themselves chained, mutilated, executed before the same crowd that once applauded their victories. And yet, the rulers continued, their desire unchecked. Their chambers became stages for rituals that blurred the line between pleasure and punishment. Naked bodies crawling on the floor while drunken nobles laughed. Royal mistresses taunted before humiliated queens. Forced unions displayed like spectacles, watched in silence, remembered in shame. The outside world never saw it. They only heard whispers too dangerous to repeat, too monstrous to believe. But the walls saw everything. The stone absorbed the cries. The tapestries hid the stains. The beds carried the weight of generations conceived not in love, but in fear. This was not passion. It was terror dressed in silk. It was power carved into flesh. It was history written in scars that never healed. And when you step inside these chambers, even now, you can feel it. The air is heavy. The shadows are thicker. You can almost hear the breath of the forgotten, gasping for freedom they never had. Because in the Welsh royal courts, sex was not intimacy. It was war. A war fought in whispers and screams, in blood and betrayal, in the breaking of bodies and the twisting of souls. Every touch decided loyalty. Every bed decided fate. And what happened in those beds didn't just mark the night. It shaped the kingdom. It determined who lived, who died, and who wore the crown. Blood decided everything. Who ruled, who fell, who lived long enough to leave their name in history. In medieval Wales, power didn't just rest on swords and armies. It rested on bloodlines, on who was born to whom, and under what circumstances. And to protect those fragile lines, kings went to terrifying extremes. Marriage wasn't love. It wasn't gentle. It was a weapon. Daughters were traded like cattle, stripped of choice, their worth measured in the alliances they could buy. A young girl might be handed to an enemy prince as a peace offering, her body the contract inked in flesh. Others were locked inside chambers, guarded like prisoners, their purity preserved for the day their father decided to use them as bargaining chips. But purity itself was often a lie. Behind the closed doors of castles, family ties twisted into something far darker. Some rulers married their cousins. Others reached even closer, taking sisters, aunts, even nieces into their beds. It wasn't lust alone. It was strategy. They believed keeping blood unbroken meant keeping power intact. But what it really bred was paranoia, madness, and heirs scarred by the sins of their fathers. The threat of betrayal haunted every marriage. A woman who strayed, or was even rumored to, could face punishments that were brutal and humiliating. Heads shaved to mark shame, flesh torn open with whips. Some dragged to public execution, their deaths turned into spectacles of warning. Every punishment screamed the same message. A woman's body was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. Men, however, moved by different rules. Kings flaunted mistresses openly. They taunted their wives with lovers draped in jewels, forcing them to watch while bastards were raised as if they too had claims to the throne. These illegitimate heirs were dangerous sparks that could ignite civil war, bloody succession disputes, and entire dynasties crumbling from within. And still, the kings did not stop. They didn't hide their sins. They paraded them. In these courts, sex was never private. It was political. Every union, every affair, every whispered rumor had weight. A kiss could change alliances. A pregnancy could tear kingdoms apart. A single scandal could spark rebellion in the valleys below. This was the reality of Welsh royalty lust, not as indulgence, but as a currency of power. And the cost of breaking those rules was unbearable. For women, humiliation. For men, mutilation or death. For entire families, the loss of power, land, and legacy. No one was safe. Not the queen, not the mistress, not the servant dragged unwilling into the king's bed. But the horror didn't stop there, because the rules themselves were twisted. They were written by kings who used the law as another instrument of desire. Laws that turned rape into theft. Laws that valued a woman's virginity more than her life. Laws that carved the boundaries of lust into the flesh of the people they ruled. And when those laws were enforced, when punishment fell, the cries didn't just fill the air. They left stains that never vanished from the stone. Because in this kingdom, the bed was as deadly as the battlefield. And some kings were about to write new codes of lust that would shock even their own people. The law was never meant to protect them. It was meant to control them. In the 12th century, the laws of Hywel Dda carved order into Welsh society. But within those laws lay a code of flesh and punishment so brutal it stripped humanity away. These weren't laws of justice. They were laws of the bedchamber. A woman caught in adultery faced a sentence that read like torture. She could be beaten until blood ran down her back, beaten so close to death that breath rattled in her lungs but never fully left. For her, there was no escape, no mercy. Her sin was branded across her body. Yet the man who betrayed his wife with another woman walked free. He didn't need to hide. He didn't need to fear. The law bent to him. The law protected him. Virginity became a weapon. A bride's worth was measured not in love, not in loyalty, but in whether her body had been untouched. If her husband claimed she was not pure, the humiliation was swift and merciless. She could be stripped, inspected, exposed before the eyes of the court. If the claim proved true, her family was ruined, their reputation shattered, their wealth drained away. One accusation could destroy generations. Even worse was how the law treated violation. Rape was not recognized as horror. It was reduced to theft. A woman's body was not her own. It was property, a possession belonging to her father, her husband, or her family. If stolen, it could be repaid in cattle, in gold, in whatever price the law decided her body was worth. The crime was not what was done to her. The crime was that a man had taken what belonged to another. And when justice came, it didn't come with fairness. It came with fear. Imagine standing in those courts, chains biting into your wrists, your voice trembling as men debated your value in livestock. You hear the verdict as if you were no more than a sheep or a coin, your body weighed and traded. That was law. That was order. That was the legacy of Highwell DDA's code. But the law did more than punish. It silenced. It reinforced the idea that women existed only as currency in the marketplace of power. Every rule carved into the code pressed deeper into their skin, branding them as possessions of the court. The law wasn't a shield. It was a weapon. A man could wield it like a blade, destroying reputations, crushing families, reducing lives to nothing more than property disputes. The violence of the law infected the halls of power. Justice itself became an extension of control. To live in those courts was to live under constant threat. A glance, a rumor, a whisper of scandal could spiral into ruin. And all the while, the men who ruled the kingdom indulged freely, untouchable, beyond consequence. Even centuries later, the words of those laws chill the blood. They expose the reality that in these courts, sex was never intimacy. It was structure. It was hierarchy. It was power written into law. Law didn't tame the violence. It sharpened it. It gave it rules. It gave it teeth. But the darkness of the Welsh royal courts didn't end with laws etched in ink. Because what took place in public was nothing compared to the secret rituals that unfolded in the dead of night. Humiliation wasn't an accident in the Welsh royal courts. It was a weapon, a ritual, a spectacle designed to break spirits as much as bodies. Behind locked doors, humiliation became law, and law became theater. What took place in those chambers wasn't whispered love. It was degradation dressed as power. Mistresses were paraded half-naked through corridors, forced to stand before queens, whose faces burned with rage they dared not show. Their bodies became trophies, stripped of dignity, displayed like spoils of war. The queen herself was forced to witness her rival's beauty, her humiliation sharpened into silence. Every gasp from the courtiers wasn't admiration. It was cruelty. It was laughter that cut deeper than any blade. Servants, trapped at the lowest rung of this cruel ladder, were forced into roles they could never refuse. Spies in their masters' chambers, ordered to watch, to listen, to remember every detail of a forbidden's kiss or a stolen embrace. Then dragged before the court, trembling as they repeated the secrets they'd seen. Their voices stuttered while drunken lords jeered. Their words became weapons that shattered reputations and sealed fates. The rulers themselves blurred the line between dominance and violation. Whispers tell of nobles' wives stolen from their marriage beds, dragged to a king's chamber not for passion, but for proof of power. These weren't affairs. They were declarations. A message that no man, no household, no bloodline was beyond the reach of the crown. One night of forced submission could unmake a family, stripping a noble of honor while the king smiled in triumph. Women weren't partners in these rituals. They were pawns, stripped of humanity and displayed as living objects. crawling on cold stone floors while lords laughed above them, ordered to kneel, to bow, to present themselves not as women, but as symbols of obedience. Some were stripped bare to prove they carried no daggers, no hidden threats, as if their bodies themselves were weapons. The humiliation was layered. It was physical. It was psychological. And it was endless. Even marriage, the supposed foundation of dynasties, became a stage for degradation. A noble bride could find her wedding night turned into a public spectacle. Lords gathered to watch as the union was consummated, the act not private but ceremonial, a grotesque show to prove loyalty, fertility, and dominance. Her cries, whether of shame, fear, or pain, were swallowed by drunken cheers. Her first night as a wife was not her own. It was the court's entertainment. This wasn't desire. It wasn't lust. It was control disguised as ritual, humiliation turned into performance. It bound the court together, not through loyalty, but through shared cruelty. Everyone became complicit. Everyone watched. Everyone learned that the crown could strip you down to nothing, your pride, your body, your soul. In these rituals, power wasn't whispered. It was shouted. The message was clear. Defy the crown, and you will be paraded, exposed, and broken. Submit, and you may survive, though never whole. The scars left behind weren't just on skin. They were carved into memory, into lineage, into the very blood of Wales. But even these twisted displays weren't the darkest secrets of the Welsh courts, because some rulers went further, into relationships so forbidden, so taboo, that they left a stain on the dynasty forever. Blood was everything in the Welsh royal courts. It was power. It was currency. It was obsession. And to protect that blood, rulers went to extremes so twisted they crossed into horror. They didn't just guard their bloodlines. They locked them tight. They turned inward. Cousins married cousins, binding families in knots of suspicion and decay. Some whispered that brothers took sisters, that fathers claimed daughters, all under the excuse of keeping dynasties pure. It was not love. It was not even lust. It was strategy disguised as sin. The crown demanded control, and even the most forbidden acts became weapons of survival. But purity came at a cost. These unions didn't strengthen dynasties. They poisoned them. Behind the walls of Welsh castles, jealousy festered like rot. Queens feared mistresses. Mistresses feared queens. Rivals plotted in silence, sharpening daggers of rumor and poison. One sip of wine could end a dynasty. One whisper of betrayal could start a war. Bastard sons rose in the shadows, born of scandal, eager to prove themselves. Some murdered fathers. Others slaughtered brothers. Succession was never certain. The throne was a prize soaked in blood, and every heir legitimate or not fought to claim it. The court became a nest of vipers, each strike tearing the family further apart. And when incest wasn't enough to secure power, abduction took its place. Powerful men stormed rival estates, dragging women from their families in the night. They weren't stolen for passion. They were stolen to break bloodlines, to force marriages that would tilt power, to crush rivals without drawing a sword. For some women, captivity ended in a cold marital bed. For others, in something far worse. Every abduction sent ripples of terror across the land. Families locked their daughters away. Fathers swore revenge. Brothers sharpened blades in silence. Yet still it continued, because power demanded flesh, and flesh was the most effective weapon of all. In the Welsh courts, blood and sex could not be separated. They were tangled, twisted, inseparable. Every act of desire carried the weight of politics. Every birth carried the burden of war. A child born of incest carried whispers of weakness. A child born of abduction carried the scars of conquest. And each of them stood as symbols of dynasties built not on strength, but on violence. Imagine being born into that world. You open your eyes in a castle filled with whispers. You are told your blood is sacred, but you know it is poisoned. You are told your destiny is greatness, but you see your siblings sharpen knives. You walk through corridors lined with tapestries of saints, but hear screams echoing from chambers above. That was the childhood of kings. That was the inheritance of heirs. The courts rotted from the inside, not with fire, not with armies, but with betrayal bred into the blood itself. The more they tried to preserve their purity, the more they destroyed it. The more they clung to bloodlines, the more those bloodlines turned against them. And still, the crown demanded obedience. Still, the cycle continued. Incest, abduction, betrayal. It was endless. It was madness. It was the true curse of the Welsh royal courts. But even incest and abduction pale compared to what came next. Because when desire became punishment, when pleasure turned to death, the horrors of these courts reached their blood-soaked climax. Desire didn't just ruin reputations in the Welsh courts. It destroyed flesh. It broke bones. It ended lives. What began in whispers ended in fire. What started in passion ended in screams. A woman accused of infidelity could be dragged through the halls, her hair torn from her scalp, her body stripped bare. There was no trial, no defense. She was thrown onto the pyre, flames clawing at her skin, while lords and servants watched in silence. Her death wasn't justice, it was theater. A warning carved into the air with smoke and ash. Men fared no better. To touch the king's mistress was to sign your own death warrant. Some were gutted in courtyards, their intestines spilling into the dirt as onlookers gagged. Others were tied to posts and beaten until their bones shattered. Their screams echoed against stone walls, carried through villages as a reminder. Pleasure belonged only to the crown. To cross that line meant death. Even noble heirs were not untouchable. Princes, cousins, and favored sons all fell when their affairs threatened the throne. Executioners sharpened their blades on royal stone, and blood from royal veins stained the very floors they once dreamed of ruling. Succession wasn't just politics. It was war fought inside the bedchamber, and even the highest born could be sacrificed when desire was mistaken for ambition. The torture chambers were never silent. Iron restraints scorched flesh. Chains rattled against damp stone. Whips cracked until skin split open, until red rivers ran across cold floors. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed their rulers with their final breath, but none walked away. Their agony became part of the court's rhythm, as common as music, as expected as prayer. Public humiliation bled into public death. Prisoners were dragged through streets, their naked bodies displayed like trophies of shame. Stones and filth rained down on them as the crowd jeered. Sometimes the end came with a blade, sometimes with a rope, and sometimes it came slower death by exposure, left to rot where every passerby could see the consequence of defiance. These were not isolated punishments. They were calculated, ritualized. Every lash of the whip was a warning. Every mutilated body was a message. Every corpse hanging from castle gates was a declaration. Sex was not freedom. Sex was not yours. It belonged to the dynasty, and the dynasty alone. To betray, that was to invite a death more brutal than any battlefield could offer. You can almost hear it, the crack of leather slicing the air, the thud of fists against bone, the wet gurgle of a throat opening under steel. You stand in the courtyard, forced to watch as another body falls. You cannot look away. The message isn't meant for them. It's meant for you. The line between desire and death blurred until no one could tell them apart. A stolen glance could lead to the dungeon. A kiss in the wrong corridor could cost your life. Fear became the only true law. Lovers hid in shadows. Servants whispered in code. And still, no one felt safe, because anyone could be accused. Anyone could be next. This was the legacy of lust twisted into tyranny. A world where passion meant punishment, where every heartbeat of desire could be your last. A dynasty that chained sex to the scaffold, that turned intimacy into execution, and left its people drowning in terror. And when the dynasty finally crumbled, it did not fall with glory. It fell with screams. Its true inheritance was not power or honor. It was fear. The Welsh courts did not simply die with conquest. They bled out slowly. Their rulers were dragged into graves, but their sins refused to follow. The walls that once shook with feasts and oaths still held the stench of betrayal. Secrets didn't vanish. They lingered like rot beneath stone. The dynasties left behind were not remembered for glory. They were remembered in whispers. Rumors of brothers in bed with sisters, of cousins birthing children that would later cut each other's throats, of queens accused of poison, burned as the court applauded. Priests tried to bury these stories under sermons and rewritten chronicles, but fragments survived. They slipped into old law codes, into poems sung by bards, into the muttered confessions of survivors who lived long enough to see their families erased. Even now, the castles remain, empty shells scattered across Wales. Tourists step into their ruins and see only stone. They imagine knights clashing in battle, noble queens gazing from towers, the beauty of medieval pageantry. But history's pageantry hides blood. If you listen closely, the stones tell a different story. The silence inside those halls is not gentle. It is heavy. Walk alone, and you hear it. The faint rattle of chains dragged across damp floors. The echo of fists pounding against wooden doors. The muffled sobs of women stolen from their homes, their bodies traded like cattle for alliances they never chose. These are not ghosts of romance. They are ghosts of torment. Every courtyard once doubled as a stage of terror. Children saw their mothers humiliated, stripped, and lashed for accusations whispered in the dark. Men watched their brothers hang from the gates, their corpses twisting in the wind as a warning. These were not punishments for crimes. They were spectacles. Lessons carved into flesh so that the living would not forget who owned their lives, their bodies, their futures. The records that remain are fragmented, broken deliberately to hide shame. But still they leak enough truth to chill the spine. A law code here, punishing women more severely than men for adultery. A poem there, mourning a lord slain not in battle, but in his lover's chamber. They reveal a system not of honor, but of control. The courts were not kingdoms of romance. They were machines built to grind human desire into obedience. Step inside the ruins today, and the air still tastes of it. Cold, metallic, like iron pressed to skin. You stand where nobles once feasted and cannot shake the sense that someone is watching. Shadows stretch long in corners. Wind whistles through cracks like distant screaming. The castles do not feel abandoned. They feel alive. Alive with the weight of everything that happened within them. The Welsh courts left a legacy carved deeper than politics. They built dynasties on fear, where sex was weapon, where love could kill you, where power demanded not just loyalty, but blood. This legacy outlived their crowns. It survived in stories told at firesides, in warnings passed from mother to daughter, in the mistrust of rulers who wore velvet but demanded obedience with steel. And so the castles remain, not as relics of nobility, but as monuments of terror. Their stones are not silent. They whisper. They whisper of queens who burned, of lovers torn apart, of heirs strangled in their sleep. They whisper of chambers that became cages, of beds that became execution grounds. They whisper so that no one forgets. The Welsh courts were never just political kingdoms. They were chambers of sexual terror. And though the crowns turned to dust, the walls never lost their memory. Long after conquest, long after silence, long after history tried to bury the truth, the walls still remember.